For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. Visit us online at faith.yale.edu. This episode was made possible in part by the generous support of the Tyndale House Foundation. For more information, visit tyndale.foundation.
God doesn't see borders. In my theological thinking, I don't imagine a God or theologize a God asking, show me your papers. God's asking different questions. Did you feed me? Did you give me something to drink? Did you clothe me? During this trip to Nogales, we came across a group of students and they were celebrating Mass. We were walking right by them. We were on the U.S. side, they were on the Mexican side. And they asked us, do we want to celebrate Mass there? And what I see that moment is that Mass, that prayer, was a form or expression of resistance, of pushing back that there are no borders between us. Prayer doesn't see borders. Faith doesn't see borders. That's the power of religion. I think the power of theology and power of prayer is that it works, not always, but in its true sense, it works to build bridges, not walls.
This is For the Life of the World, a podcast about seeking and living a life worthy of our humanity. I'm Evan Rosa with the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land, here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she, with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. The New Colossus, Emma Lazarus, 1883. The generous spirit, the welcome for the wandering, taking in the homeless stranger, the refugee. These words that inscribe the Statue of Liberty offer a hopeful image of an America with open arms, a beacon of hospitality and safety in a dangerous world. How do we square this symbol of welcoming freedom with the reality of immigration policy today? Detention centers crowded with young, isolated children, separated from their families. Exploitation of undocumented migrants for agricultural labor. Billions of dollars spent on the wall, the false nativism, the possessiveness, the fear of fair-skinned European American immigrants. Alongside the ideals of the New Colossus embracing the, quote, tired, poor, huddled masses, a history of racial purity, exclusion, xenophobia, and fear can be seen in immigration policy. From the Chinese Exclusion Act just 4 years before the dedication of Lady Liberty, to the discriminatory immigration quotas of the Johnson-Reed Act in 1924, all the way up to the Muslim travel ban of 2017. In the spring of 2018, approximately 5,500 children were separated from their families by Trump's zero-tolerance policy, and 1,700 children still live in detention centers without their families 3 years later. But how does this balance with the rights of a nation to enforce and manage its political borders? How should those borders be enforced, and how to do it justly? How should we prioritize national security and cultural integrity with a call to welcome the tempest-tossed stranger through our golden doors? Well, beyond the dizzying political and moral questions that we have with us always, Francisco Lozada is thinking theologically about immigration and the migrant experience. He's the Charles Fisher Catholic Professor of New Testament and Latinx Studies at Brite Divinity School in Fort Worth, Texas. Lozada draws on his experience at U.S. Mexico borderlands as he leads travel seminars and teaching about immigration and justice from a theological framework. In this episode, we discuss the influence of liberation theology's guiding principle of the preferential option for the poor, the centrality of history in understanding immigration, the problem of American xenophobia, the racialization of U.S. immigration policy, and the ways of Jesus, himself a migrant and refugee, crossing borders and boundaries throughout the gospel narrative. Thanks for listening today, friends. Francisco, thanks for joining me on For the Life of the World.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for welcoming.
Absolutely. I wonder if we could start by talking a little bit about your personal vocation, what you do, and how you think about your scholarship and when you, especially the nature of your scholarship and the topics and concerns that you work on, how you integrate your own spirituality and your own personal ethics with your scholarship.
Yeah. When I think about my vocation and how it plays into my research, my teaching, my work, dealing with questions around borderlands issues these days, I think I have to go back to childhood. I grew up in a Spanish-speaking parish in Cleveland, Ohio. And I think that has had some formative elements for me in terms of my vocation. Most people don't think of Cleveland, for example, as a very ethnically driven city. And is quite ethnically driven. I can still remember going into different sections of the city, hearing different languages. But I think a lot of it has to do with the people there. My vocation is in the relationships. And that theme of relationship, when I reflect back, it's always carried on to the present. We did everything together in that parish, but it was respect for the other, respect for this other person. We shared our food. We passed along traditions. And I can still remember one year, my father was very engaged in parish life. And I still remember this family coming from somewhere. I don't know where exactly, but I was just very young. And one Christmas morning, we took a bag of food over to their house. You're in an urban context, but it's that element of sharing, that element of having a relationship with the other, no matter who that person is, I think carries on or filters into my work, whether it's the work that I do now in my field is focused more along the lines of cultural biblical hermeneutics. I think that's one expression of that vocation. But it's also the other expression is through advocacy work. But advocacy could be defined in a broad sense. It's not, everyone has certain gifts that they prefer to express. And mine, I think, is raising consciousness in many ways.
Yeah. You've been involved at the U.S Mexico border. You've done work specifically with migrants. And I wonder if you could set some of the context for your scholarship and your research in that experiential context.
All my work is an expression of that vocation, that call to raise consciousness. My work on the borderlands, when I think back, it stems of two experiences. There's an experience where I was living in San Antonio, and my son always played competitive soccer. And there was one boy who was undocumented who lived on the South Side. If you understand the world of the undocumented, they're very careful of who they let in, but also where their kids are going. And I don't know what drove me there. It's just that I had this compassion for people who are always not in a privileged position. That's one. Relationship, again, comes up. And then the other element for me is proximity.
Yeah.
That is that we're not going to be able to solve everything in the world, but why not start in your local area or your region? In my case, it was the region in the sense of borderlands, because if you're living in Texas, for example, which I do, you're seeing borderlands everywhere. I mean, you can open up your front door and you can see someone. If you talk to them, if they share their stories, they'll tell you where they came from, how they got there, and how they survive on a day-to-day basis. So the element of proximity for me, working on the borderlands, was important. It's like living somewhere and pretending nothing's going on, like you're in a bubble. I couldn't deal with that. You have to build trust, and one needs to be careful of re-traumatizing people who've just arrived, for example. And it can be from Central America, be from Mexico. I've seen people from Europe, Eastern Europe, Cuba, Haiti, South America. The majority are Central Americans and Mexicans, of course. But the shelters were lined up with people from across the globe in many respects. And people who are on the front line can share those stories, articulate those stories much better than I can. But my relationship with borderlands organizations is trying to, what can I do to help them in their work? And that goes back to the question for me of solidarity, that I want to be in solidarity with them.
What does solidarity mean in the context of immigration?
Solidarity is a term that you hear a lot, and it's theorized a lot among theologians. But for me, it's a giving up of oneself to be in the shoes of that person. And that, of course, that's always challenging. I have so many safety nets. One is citizenship and, of course, economics, education, and whatnot. So it's getting to know their story, getting to know who they are, and then beginning to challenge the structures that are in place that has in some way or the other placed them in that situation. And it's not a temporary thing. Solidarity is not a temporary thing. It's a lifelong commitment.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it is driven by my influence by liberation theology. The work of Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, was also a very influential book for me growing up. Jean Sombrino has talked about solidarity in the past, and it's how do you bring U.S. churches in solidarity with the plight of the poor in Latin America? Solidarity is the relinquishing of our power to allow a encounter with the other to occur.
Beautiful. I mean, that concept of relationality is coming back.
Yeah.
That, of course, it's not just any kind of relationality. It's a kind of relationality that's informed by, like you say, encounter with the other, but a kind of shared expression of dignity.
Yeah.
Really, is acknowledging their personhood, acknowledging their humanity. And yeah, I like this idea of shedding or relinquishing, at least in mindset, right? To kind of strip away some of those elements that would otherwise set up a boundary or set up a wall between us. And if we can shed those, then we can kind of see more deeply the common humanity that's shared between us. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how liberation theology has informed your specific approach to this, and just say a little bit about what that brings to the table for you.
I would say one of the guiding principles is the preferential option of the poor. And how does that get expressed? Is it gets expressed through community. It gets expressed of taking care of the other.
Yeah. That
they are more important than ourselves in some sense. You can't love the other if you don't love God. And so it's a theology that begins from the lived realities of the people, the faith of the people in certain contexts where it's our experience of suffering, the experiencing of oppression, experiencing of marginality that gives rise to the theological articulation.
Yeah.
It'll be expressed understanding Jesus, for example, as someone who is with us. And sometimes it gets expressed through language as well. And so this is a Jesus that walks with us through our suffering. You can see this with migrant journeys as well. It's religion that gives them the theology, the faith that gives them the resilience to deal with the oppressive structures that are in play, where there's the border patrol or the entire informal sector of the economy, like people who are smuggling humans across, and then, of course, being robbed, females being raped, and so forth. Liberation theology gives me this impetus to continue working for the marginalized. So you're looking through migrants, you're looking through oppression in society to begin to ask the question, how ought we try to live, but also these principles or the theologies or these institutions, who are they benefiting at the end of the day? Preferential option for the poor, justice, solidarity, all these things, all these ideas, all these principles are all working together. A good example, if I bring it back to the border issues, how does liberation theology sort of play out in my work there? Then I would say that it's beginning to reframe the narrative of why immigration has occurred. For example, what a lot of movies do and a lot of documentaries do is give you a narrative of why someone migrates.
Yeah.
And I think what I try to do is to say, wait a minute, there are different reasons why people move.
Well, give us an example of like what you view as the kind of most common cultural representation of why people migrate.
Well, the most common one is economics. So people are leaving Central America for a better way of living. And that's true. I mean, because of U.S. economic policies, it does play a role in pushing people, dislocates them.
But it also shows how inflected the immigration conversation for American society is through that American dream of prosperity and upward mobility.
Right. Let's say someone migrating to make more money in order to have a better life. That's one narrative. People move for various other reasons. I mean, some people think it's involuntary. Some people think it's voluntary. These days, a lot of people are beginning to focus on climate-driven migration.
Yeah. Yep.
War is another reason. Famine is another reason.
Mm-hmm.
People move for a variety of different reasons, but the understanding of what liberation theology does is begins to deconstruct those structural institutions that are at play
Mm-hmm.
in why people dislocate, whether it's the southern border or whether it's from Syria to Europe or from Africa to Europe. It's because how you understand migration will influence how you respond to immigration. And so if you listen to the political rhetoric over the last couple of years, the constant term is the invasion, the invasion,
Yeah.
the invasion. You can actually go back in the 1920s and begin to hear some of that rhetoric as well, the rhetoric that emanates out of a nativistic way of understanding migration, and then coupled with this false notion that one race is superior over the other. And if you allow another race to come in, it will infect that race. And so you can hear some echoes of that in the last several years.
Certainly. And that's the nationalism that has just been,
exactly,
when you define the nation as this kind of impermeable and pure, I mean, you can see where the logic of that thinking ends, and it's a dark place. But it's fascinating to think about how should we think about immigration as this kind of human phenomenon when our culture forces it through the lens of the strength of the nation and the strength of a nation's borders to protect the individuals and citizens of that nation. Or when you think of immigration as this kind of grabbing after the scarce resources that nation has, or when you think of immigration as cutting in line, and you can begin to see how the concepts of possession or the concepts of ownership really start to inform our general perspective on these human beings that are in this situation as migrants.
Yeah.
How should we be thinking about it? What should replace those frameworks for a more just way of reflecting on and finding solidarity with the migrant?
Yeah. I think it's very important to move away from one meta-narrative of why people move. After taking students down to El Paso or Nogales, one of the things I always leave those they're called travel seminars for me, is that I feel like my head is spinning around as it just turns around, because it's such a complex issue.
It's disorienting.
It's disorienting. Yes, exactly. And it's like, there's not one way to think about it. What's very important for particularly congregations to this day is listen to the stories of why they're migrating.
And like you say, there's not one meta-narrative that applies to every person. You have to particularize it. You have to let it come from the bottom up.
Exactly. And that's the lived reality of the people will contribute to constructing a theological, response to an ethical theological response. And so it's a multifaceted phenomenon.
Yeah.
And what applies in the southern border of the U.S. doesn't always necessarily apply what's happening in other parts of the world. There's similarities here and there, but we're working with a different construction of political reality. We're connected because of our history. That is, we're responsible because we are related to others. Theologically, but also I would say historically. What I'm trying to say is that because of our historical role in South America, we do have a responsibility.
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to argue. People want to cut off that history with immigration issues today. Like all of a sudden, it's like, I don't care what they did back. I wasn't there in 1960s or 1950s or 1940s. So I had no responsibility from those policies. I had nothing to do with those policies. But you're living off the benefit of those policies today.
You can see the sister analogy with the concept of reparation. Nietzsche said that the primary sin of the philosopher, and maybe anyone who's advocating along the lines you've just described, is to operate outside of history, ahistorically.
Ahistorical. That's the worst. I think if going back to your question on immigration, I would say the immigration is historical. In other words, you can't construct an immigration narrative that's ahistorical. And it's otherwise you're creating a different narrative that's not true that will lead to what I would call an unethical response.
Yeah.
And an unethical response would be shutting the border down, not
separating families.
Yeah. Those sort of things. Yeah. And so I think you have to look at the political, social, economic structures of the time to begin to, at least for me, articulate a theological understanding.
What's so interesting about this is it's easy to ignore the historical humanity of an individual migrant, and then as a comfortable citizen in a suburb or a city somewhere or rural America where you get a media representation or you get a journalistic photo essay, what's happening. And even that is ahistorical in some sense, right? Because the understanding of that individual isn't informed by, no, this person came from a particular place. They've been dislocated. This is their family history that led to that. And it allows you to just kind of abstract away from their essential particularity as a person.
Yeah. Right.
And of course, that's going to lead to a kind of glossing over of their rights, the ability to ignore their dignity as a human being.
Right.
I wonder if we could, this might feel like backtracking a little bit, but I wonder if you could articulate just what a border is. What is the political border? And how does our definition of borders inflect or inform policy making about it or popular opinion about it?
Yeah. Let me try to respond from a theological perspective, because I think I've done some reading on the history of the border, at least the southern border, by historians, geographers, political scientists, and whatnot. It's very contested interpretation of the border, at least the southern border. The history is actually quite fascinating.
I'm sure.
Oscar Martinez in Troublesome Border begins to provide a historical account how the border became border after the Treaty of Guadalupe in 1848. And so, you begin to see the political actors at play and how that border gets constructed. The border's always, at least in U.S. history, has changed. That's not the first border. I mean, we can go in U.S. history.
Look at the political maps
over the course of time. It's the political map. Just look at the political maps over the time. The border has always been expanded, right? From a theological perspective, I think, for me, the border it's not fixed. In other words, I know there's this tension that sovereign nations have the right to control who comes in and who does not. And that is a tension that I recognize, I struggle with as well, but it doesn't inform a lot of why I do what I do in some ways. In other words, for me, the border is less about the geographical space and more about the relationships. I mean, borders they're constructions. I always found this interesting when I see things from space. No one can recognize borders. No one sees the borders. Everything's blended. And when you're in El Paso, Texas, for example, I think it's called the Franklin Mountains or beginning the Franklin Mountains. There's a place where you can go up and begin to look. And the first thing I like to do is take students there. Right, my colleague Erasema Coronado, who at the time was teaching at UTEP, University of Texas, El Paso, we would take students up there, and because you can see Ciudad Juarez from a distance, but we always sort of play this game of tell us where it begins and where it ends, and it's always blurred.
We'll be back with more from Francisco Lozada in just a moment. Hello, listeners. We do not want podcasting to be a one-sided conversation. So let's try something fun. In 2022, we're going to roll out some experimental segments for the show, and they involve your voice. First, we're inviting you to office hours. You have a burning question, observation, objection, or just want to know more about a topic we cover? Simply record your question with your smartphone and send us the clip by email at faith@yale.edu. This might surprise you, but a lot of professional podcasts, including ours, use smartphone audio for guests. We'll review your questions every week and include your voice on the show before we discuss, either with that week's guest or Miroslav Volf, or a friend of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture. Second, in keeping with our purpose to help people envision and pursue lives worthy of our humanity, maybe you have a way of articulating an answer to that question that's worth sharing. If so, send a 2-minute clip of yourself tackling life's most enduring question. What does it mean to live a life worthy of our humanity? We'll give it a listen and then share with all the other listeners of the show. This is our way of calling out from the podcast cave in hopes of getting a response from outside the echo chamber. Happy recording, friends. But it really puts pressure on that about the indefinability, ultimately, of borders. And the way that they are really a constructed reality. It's a social reality.
Right.
It's a political reality. Right. They're not essential borders.
Yeah.
Right.
And they're not, what I say, they're not fixed. They're not, we could change borders easily through political agreements.
Things have.
Even nature sometimes changes borders.
That's right. And it's certainly with the new climate crisis, it's going to.
Exactly. So, I think when I think of borders also, I think of, for example, in the Gospel of John, where Jesus is crossing many different borders. And if you read the Gospel of John, there's a moment of dislocation. That is, Jesus comes from above to below, a movement of journey throughout, crossing different borders, meeting different peoples, looking at the relationships. It's the relationships, I think, that drives that plot. And what Jesus does is there's this play on a duality of recognition and non-recognition. And it sometimes plays into belief and unbelief as well, whether you see or don't see. John plays a lot with this duality within the gospel.
Yeah, fascinating.
But also at the same time, I like to think of Jesus being dislocated, right? Take on human form. Journeys, right? Right after the prologue of John, it journeys all the way to the end of the gospel, where Jesus returns back home. So there's a relocation. So if you take those three ways of looking at the plot of dislocation, journey, and relocation, you can see that pattern a little bit with migrants today. Not all migrants. I'd never want to correlate the Gospels with migrant experience per se, but there is that migrant motif in John is present there, and then playing with or exploring those various relationships that Jesus has with men and women. I think if you just take the Samaritan woman, you see this crossing over on gender. We would call today this ethnic, religious sort of crossing over from Jewish world to Samaritan. It's the relationship that's also breaking through that border. It's making it porous. But then right after the Samaritan woman, you have the story of the centurion. In some ways, the centurion is an expression of the Roman Empire. And so you're seeing this political move that, well, if you want to call it that,
go there.
Political move of Jesus moving across different political realms.
And he does it relationally.
Yeah,
is the key thing here. He does it through relating to the Samaritan woman. He does it through relating to the centurion.
And you can see it then with the lame person, lame man in John 5, the crossing over in John 6 from one location to another, to not refusing to be taken as the king of the Jews at the time. And so you can see this across the Gospel of John, this constant movement crossing over, whether socially, economically, politically, religiously. And I think when someone migrants, they're doing the same thing. They're coming from one political state to another political reality, ethnically as well, socially as well, a different way of life coming over. My question at this time in my life tends to be, how can I use this as a point of departure to raise questions about the reality of migration today?
It's a beautiful thing to think of borders in terms of relations that can more easily be transcended in the context of just human interaction. So I wonder, what else have you seen down on the U.S Mexico border that is expressive of that?
Two things come to mind. There was a moment when I traveled to Sunland Park, New Mexico, actually. It's right on the border of Texas and New Mexico. But it's a section that is, you can drive up to the fence or the wall. It's actually more of a fence. And the fence is it's made out of metal, steel. It's about, 18 feet high, very high. And it's quite fortified. And it's sort of, the pattern is a lattice, sort of. So you can see across, but it's very hard to cross that at that point. And a group of students of mine walked up to the fence where another group of children were actually on the other side, and they started up a conversation. It was just a random question, and the students were just asking them their name, where do they live?
Yeah.
But that moment's always stayed with me because it was like it was as if there was no border there, no barrier there.
Right.
And they really connected through a relationship again, this theme of relationship that I keep coming to. And I think that's that encounter that they couldn't touch, of course, but they touched each other in a different way. And it changes I think the way one sees one another, the way they see us, but also how we see them. And then there's another moment that comes to mind. And there was another travel seminar to Nogales, Arizona. And we were there one afternoon. One of the first things we like to do is take students straight to the barrier or the fence. Mm-hmm. And we did a tour of the area.
Are these patrolled?
This one is not. The Border Patrol on the Nogales is closer to you can see them maybe 100 yards away or maybe closer, looking over you. Yeah. I mean, there's sensors there. You see towers. You see the whole sort of electronic surveillance. And as soon as you drive up, they already know who you are. They run your plates. So they're and some Border Patrol are distant. Some are a bit more friendly, and they'll have a conversation with you, or they'll come up and say, who are you? Why are you here? That sort of thing. But one day during this trip to Nogales, we came across a group of students from Chicago, Illinois, and they were celebrating Mass. Yeah. We were walking right by them. We were on the U.S. side. They were on the Mexican side. And they asked do we want to celebrate Mass there? And what I see that moment is that Mass, that prayer was a form or expression of resistance, of pushing back. There are no borders between us. God doesn't see borders. In my theological thinking, I don't imagine a God or theologize a God asking, show me your papers. God's asking different questions. Did you feed me? Did you give me something to drink? Did you clothe me? Goes to the question of, again, relationship. And these, I think you can call them what you want. They're resistance to the structural world, I guess.
It's a beautiful expression of nonviolent resistance.
Yeah.
Even in this case, behaving within the realm of the law, and yet speaking truth and really living a kind of faith together that ignores the border.
Yeah.
But more than ignores.
Yeah.
Presents the ugly reality of a physical division and says, this physical division is nothing to us.
Yeah. Right.
The statement of that is very powerful.
Right, yeah. Prayer doesn't see borders. I mean, faith doesn't see borders. That's the power of religion. I think the power of theology, the power of prayer is that it works, not always, but in its true sense, it works to build bridges, not walls.
To listen to your description of how the scripture, in particular, the Gospel of John, does speak about borders today on that reading. Are borders meant to be crossed?
I would argue yes, but I think a lot of some of the friends that I socialize with in Texas would have a different take on this. And I think it goes right back to the question of why you're crossing.
Yeah.
Why are you making a journey?
How?
And how as well. And how you're making that journey. No,
but I have to say too, let's lay out a few of these things. Why? How the border is being crossed, but also how the border is being established and protected and controlled. Those three things clearly have to matter for determining
and
how we're to relate to borders.
If you focus on the how, why they migrate, for example, why are they coming, that will play into how you begin to conceive a wall or a barrier or a fence.
Right.
And you'll begin to define those things based on why people are migrants. So if you begin to cast all migrants as drug smugglers, for example,
Right.
that wall is going to be
Ridiculous.
seen as the most fortified wall in the world, right? You're going to try to keep them out. But if you see why they're migrating, because of our policies that are pushing them out of their homes, let's say the agricultural, big commercial industries that are displacing local farmers, and in complicity, I should say, I don't want to put with Mexican government sometimes in complicity with some of these policies. These people are moving, but we all have a hand in that. And so it's a binational problem that should be a binational solution.
Yeah.
I think they need to be also held accountable as well. That is other countries where the people are dislocating from. It's all interconnected. The reasons why people move, the journey itself are very different. And then how we receive migrants are very different. In the 1980s, you begin to see the rise of cable news and talk radio show. And as you begin to see the rise and the prominence of these two industries, you begin to see a fortification of the wall slowly.
Interesting.
Until you get to a 9/11 event, and then you begin to move in a whole nother direction, right? I do think that cable news as well as talk radio shows have played the role in our imagination of that narrative of why people move. And I think the way you counter it is by sharing the stories of migrants and why they're moving.
What does that do to a culture, to an individual?
It disrupts their narrative. It disrupts that one way of thinking they picked up here or there. It reframes the overall narrative of migration. What you're hoping with a new story, with a different story, is that it would touch the consciousness of the other, of the person who's listening. And so it's a way of disrupting the narrative flow that they once had to a different way of thinking. I mean, let me just see if I can give you an example of this. Maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I had a good friend who's a priest set up an arrangement with a shelter where I would bring some students to meet some of asylum seekers. But we weren't allowed to interview them because of a variety of reasons. One is you don't want to bring up traumatic events again. We weren't trained to deal with those sort of things.
Right.
But he did ask us to do a couple things. One is to serve dinner for them. And the second was to ask a couple questions only: their name, their age, and where they were from.
Yeah.
And so my students spread around the room, and we sort of matched them up with people who had a little bit of Spanish. We weren't asking for a lot from them. And then after that event, we began to serve dinner. Right before we were about to eat, we began to hear prayers that were said in all their various indigenous languages. And we're all looking at each other. And we all work with the assumption that these are people who were primary Spanish speakers. And all of a sudden, we just thought we were right there in Pentecost, Acts 2. In many ways, many tongues. And it was one of the most beautiful experiences in many ways, I think, in my lifetime. To hear this prayer, and it was all in various different indigenous languages. At least it appeared that way. It sounded that way to me because I didn't know the language myself. And then the priest concluded with some words of grace in Spanish, but nothing compared to what they were doing. Their prayer was a little longer and much more loud. And so, but it's just that encounter there with these people changed our reality of who's migrating. These are people just like us, families with kids. And some of the students began to get to know the little kids a little bit more. And the narrative is the encounter itself. That's the text in some ways. And that text really, I think, seared in our memory this element of compassion, this element of empathy, this element that we are connected, that we are linked in history, but also through our faith. And that's the underlying strategy that I have at play in my theology. It's no different what a parable does, right? It's raising the conscience, throwing you off.
And I love the disorientation that is depicted in a kind of let's call it a holy chaos
Mm-hmm.
of multiple languages,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
saying a prayer before a meal.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of disorientation pulls you closer to a person.
Mm-hmm.
It pulls you
Mm-hmm.
closer to that story that they get to tell from their
Mm-hmm.
own agency in their own words.
Yes.
And then,
Yeah.
and where I want to go with this
Yeah.
is what a different way of encountering the other, encountering the stranger
Mm-hmm.
than darkening their visage.
Yeah.
Thinking of them as a threat,
Mm-hmm.
thinking of them as grabbing for something. And it really speaks to the xenophobic moment that will tell us a little bit about how to think about, especially having started with this positive framework
Mm-hmm.
for thinking about the other and welcoming the stranger.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What will it take for us to overcome the xenophobia that we see so rampant today?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I have the answer, but this is my response. It's that I think we have to have a reckoning with our complicity in how we have constructed whiteness, I think, in our society. And I want to say whiteness not in the plural. I don't think it's one understanding, one construction, but it's in multiple constructions. And we know through history that the construction of whiteness has been redefined throughout history, at least I'm speaking here U.S. history. And what I mean by that is that our immigration policies have come out of keeping anyone who's non-white out. Just look at the Nationality Act of 1790 and granting citizenship to free white men. Actually, they even added a good moral character, I think is what it says. And I'm paraphrasing a tad here. But right there, from the very beginning, that's the first immigration act in U.S. history. And what do? They decide who belongs and who does not belong. You can go all the way up to 1882, right? The first with the Chinese Exclusion Act, again, based on race. Go to the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act, which begins to limit immigration to Eastern Europeans, allowing Western Hemisphere to migrate only because they wanted Mexicans as cheap labor. In 1924, 1882 seized Chinese immigrant labor. And so you have this strict restriction until 1965 with the Hart-Celler Act, and that opens up some restriction issues as well. I mean, it opens up the border a bit more, or immigration policy a little bit more, to allow people from different parts of the world to enter in. But many of the immigration laws that came into impact in the 20th century were strongly influenced by a racialization element of keeping certain people who were not white out. And when I talk about this, I'm not trying to cast it as an either or. I'm not trying to cast this out of a politics of resentment. It's a reckoning that we need to begin to understand how these immigration laws emerged and what are we going to do about that? If you actually look at it from 1924 to 2020, more or less, you see 100 years later, the same pattern of this element of xenophobia, underlying immigration policies, nativism still there as well. Nationality is linked to white race. So if you think of U.S. America, you think of the white race. I don't want to lump everyone into this sort of narrow construction of whiteness. All I'm trying to say is that to understand immigration today, it's not just understanding why people immigrate. We also have to understand those policies that emerged as a result of immigration throughout the 19th century, 20th century, because those policies are not written out of innocence. They have different political agendas that are at play. And for some, those policies were part of keeping out, making it very difficult to belong in the U.S. That tension still exists, I think, today. Who belongs, who does not belong. And if you don't sort of vote for a particular party, you're not one of us. So we have moved into these identity politics, and it's led to this question of resentment. It led to the question of Everyone's seeking recognition as much as possible, but there's no dialogue, there's no relationship. What I would say Trump was quite successful in was creating a wall among communities, family members, and other sorts of relationships, even within congregations. I've heard stories from students where congregations are split because of the politics of immigration. So what's happening out there is being brought back in, which has always been the case. But yeah, so I'm trying to nuance this question of whiteness and tie in, connect it a little bit to immigration policies that I think play into this who belongs, who does not belong in the U.S.
When you think about the inscription on the Statue of Liberty,
yeah,
give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. I wonder how you might construe, in light of that, in light of the xenophobia, in light of the fear and the politics of scarcity and the politics of the nation. Think about what we can learn from human mobility, what we can learn from welcoming the stranger for understanding what human flourishing really is and what it means to live a life that's worthy of our humanity.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And the Statue of Liberty, the saying that's underneath it, I think is by Emma Lazarus. The description actually it was, I think, added on later. It wasn't part of the original positioning of the Statue of Liberty there. But I always find that quite interesting because many restrictionists would argue that, you can't include that because the Statue of Liberty doesn't really signify what wasn't the original intent of what Emma Lazarus put there at the base of the statue, more or less. And I always, as someone who tinkers in the theory of interpretation or hermeneutics, as we say in theology, it really reflects the tension that we have in the United States about how we interpret our past. And again, it goes right back to the question of understanding why people move, why people dislocate, because we're going to have different interpretations on that why they move, why people across the globe are moving. But the Statue of Liberty and the saying by Emma Lazarus, I think it reflects this tension of how we interpret our past, where some people in this country around immigration wants to focus on what it means to be American through principles. It's the principles that are what's more important. And then you have other people who want to interpret a more narrow, strict understanding of what it means to be American. That tension that you see with the Statue of Liberty and Emma Lazarus, what I'm trying to say is it correlates with this tension that we see today on how do we interpret human mobility. You can see some parallels of the tension that we in this country are having with regard to interpreting the past.
And either way, we have to interpret that and understand those realities, the principles of freedom and liberty, the principles of belonging and inclusion, the principles of welcoming the stranger. And we have to continue to struggle with the meaning of our borders and bring all this together. And I think we do need to kind of stay attuned to the moment and continue to read these texts, whether it's the Gospel of John or the new Colossus poem, or just the headlines and the talking heads on the news and podcasts, wherever.
It's again, going back to the liberationist sort of paradigm. It's bringing the public realm, raising consciousness about the public realm to inform what we do in theology. It's bringing to bear the lived experience, the political realm, the socioeconomic, to our theologies, to our expressions of who we think God is, or the nature of God, or nature of sin, the nature of grace, all those theological things. For me, it can't begin out of an abstract reality. It has to begin with a lived reality. That's liberation.
When we think about the faith of the migrant, what do we learn from them? Whether or not they can articulate in the same academic theological framework, there is a theology there. It's a lived theology that is in many ways more profound than the academic can achieve by academics alone. What can we learn from the migrant about a life worth living?
Ooh. What I learned from reading and hearing their stories is a deep link, deep connection, deep relationship of their faith with God. Their faith in God is at a level that I think most people have not. It's a level where I think it's hard to understand unless you lived in their shoes. It's a deep connection. And that deep connection, that deep relationship, that deep faith, that understanding that God is active in human history, the understanding that God functions in history in a way that controls their movement. There's a phrase that I think sometimes I hear migrants say in Spanish, and it goes like, si Dios lo quiere, if God wants it, right? And I think that's a very deep theological understanding. There's a God who is functioning in history. I'm not saying it's unique, but it's a way of their understanding of who God is beyond the textbooks. It's what gives them resilience to cross those borders. It means people are not crossing at one time. People are crossing multiple times, right? They'll get detained in Mexico, sent back to Guatemala, right? And maybe not once, twice, 3 times, 4 times. It could be up to 8 times, 9 times. They can go through a lot of things through that journey, very horrific things that we can't imagine what they're going through right now.
Right.
But what I've learned is the role of faith and how faith is used as a tool of resilience to resist the structural sin that exists out there.
Francisco, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today. Really appreciate this expansive way of thinking about immigration. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
For the Life of the World is a production of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture at Yale Divinity School. This episode featured biblical scholar Francisco Lozada, production assistants by Martin Chan, Nathan Jowers, Natalie Lamb, and Logan Ledman. I'm Evan Rosa, and I edit and produce the show. For more information, visit us online at faith.yale.edu. New episodes drop every Saturday, sometimes midweek. If you're new to the show, welcome, friend. Hit subscribe in your favorite podcast listening app, and we'd love your feedback. Ratings and reviews in Apple Podcasts are particularly helpful, but we're just as happy to hear from you by email at faith@yale.edu. We read each comment and do our best to respond and improve the show, bringing you the people and topics that you want to hear. And if you're a regular listener, it's a huge honor that you stick with us from week to week. So I'll ask you to step up and join us. Help us share the show. Behind those 3 dots in your podcast app, there's an option to share this episode by text or email or social media. If you took a brief moment to send your favorite episode to a friend or share with the world, not only would you be supporting the show, you'd be sparking up a great conversation around stuff that matters with people that matter. Thanks for listening today, friends. We'll be back with more this coming week.